Welcome everyone. It's great to see everybody. We're going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. We do have a lot of material to cover. I also want to encourage all of you. Let me make sure this is okay. I want to encourage all of you to ask questions as we go through the presentation. Feel free to put them in the chat, and our team will monitor the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me as we go through the presentation. Um, so I think all of you have heard, and of course we sent out the document yesterday, that we are proposing some changes to the LAC operational guidelines. The last update was 14 years ago, so we're due for some updates. We created a task force early this year, including members of the CAI Government and Public Affairs Committee, some LAC chairs, and some chapter executive directors. And all of these individuals were intentionally selected so that we had a broad representation from various size states, various size legislative action committees, states with a single CAI chapter, multiple CAI chapters, et cetera. And so I want to first of all start by thanking all of the individuals who served on this task force. The names are on their screen. We did have robust discussion as we went through 3 or 4 meetings to discuss these proposed updates. And so everyone's feedback and input was greatly appreciated throughout that process. So why are we doing this, and what's the goal of these proposed updates? So first of all, to better serve the membership. That's the reason why we do everything, as well as chapters from an advocacy and public policy perspective, to positively impact and strengthen our advocacy initiatives. We really want to foster collaboration between chapters and LACs. We want to empower chapters relative to the operation of your legislative action committees. But at the same time, we want to simplify some things like the delegate appointment process, clarify delegate officer terms and term limits, provide some clarity and standardization to LAC structures, and to establish some political action committee guidelines for states that wish to create a political action committee, because that is an important tool in the advocacy toolkit. So we have, I believe there's 17 slides. Sounds like a lot. 17 major changes to the guidelines. I'm going to go through them one at a time. Some of them are very simple with a minimal impact on the work that all of you do at the chapter level, and some of them will have a more substantial impact. Again, feel free to ask questions as we go. I am going to ask my fellow GMPA team members to monitor the chat because it's not showing well on my screen because I have multiple sharing. So feel free to interrupt me if there's questions. So the first change, this is a minimal impact on all of you. The routine oversight of legislative action committees will transfer to the Government and Public Affairs Committee, subject to the authority of the CAI Board of Trustees. This is really internal procedures for staff and CAI volunteer leadership over delegate appointments, delegate approvals, approving new legislative action committees, et cetera. So this will have a very minimal impact on the work and the role that all of you have in our legislative action committees. The next one is the number of delegates per LAC. So currently, you can have between 6 and 20 delegates. We're proposing an increase in the maximum number to 30. And that is to accommodate larger states, larger legislative action committees, states with multiple CAI chapters. And so how this will work is, first of all, you're not mandated to change the number of delegates on your LAC as it is today. You can keep the same number if you'd like, as long as there's at least 6. You can go up to 30 if you think that's right for your state and your chapters. LACs should have a conversation among all of the chapters in your states to collaborate on what you all think is the appropriate number of delegates for your state, as well as your ability to recruit volunteers who are willing to serve, because that plays a role here too. What doesn't change is a balance of the member categories. All CAI member categories is still required on each legislative action committee. So you have to have homeowners, managers, business partners on your LAC, and no one member category can have a majority on the LAC. Let me check the chat. Okay. Um, Is this a one-time change or something that can be periodically reviewed and updated? Yes, you can change that as you see fit, Mike. So if you think this year you need 25 delegates and next year you might want 27 or 18, yes, that is a decision up to the chapters and the LAC in your state. Okay, moving on. So all LAC delegate appointments will be made by chapter board of directors. There will be no at-large delegates moving forward. And let me just remind everyone that none of this is final. This is all pending action by the board of trustees in August. We'll talk a little bit about the next steps when we get to the end of the presentation. So this is a process change. The intent of this update is to empower chapters to be more involved in the critical advocacy work of CAI. And so chapters and LACs should collaborate. Again, you're going to hear the word collaborate a lot through this presentation. We want you to collaborate on delegate recruitment, calls for volunteers. LACs are encouraged to recommend delegate candidates to the chapter board, and we encourage chapter boards to give due consideration to those recommendations. We are going to require board presidents and LAC chairs to sign a certification of appointments document that simply will say that the board presidents from the chapters in the state and the chair of the LAC agree on the delegates that have been appointed. The intent here is not to deny the LAC the ability to appoint delegates. The intent here is to have all of these parties, chapters, and LACs in the state collaborate on who serves on the Legislative Action Committee and to make sure that we have appropriate voices, legislative experience, knowledge, and expertise represented on the LAC. What doesn't change is the authority that the LAC has. So the LAC is the body that is authorized to establish legislative priorities, legislative strategy, establish a budget for the LAC, and hire the lobbyist in the state. So as we were discussing this change, I do want to delve a little bit deeper here. As we were discussing this change, we did get feedback from several members of the task force and some others who've reached out to me about the fact that LACs often use the at-large appointment process to balance the LAC among member categories, geographically, etc. That process doesn't change, but when that balancing occurs, will change. And so instead of the chapters appointing chapter delegates and the LAC doing the balancing work after the boards make the appointments, what will happen now is those conversations should happen in advance of any chapter board making delegate appointments. So in a state with multiple chapters, we encourage, again, the chapter CEDs, chapter board presidents, the chair of the LAC, the executive committee of the LAC, whatever group of people you think is appropriate for your state, to have that conversation before you make appointments. How many delegates you want to have on the LAC, who they should be, geographic balance, member category balance. So those conversations and decisions can be made before the appointments are finalized, and everyone comes to an agreement. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions on this particular topic. If there are currently at-large delegates appointed by the LAC Executive Committee, do they stay or removed and reappointed through the chapter board? So, Carissa, I would say a couple things. So, again, let me reemphasize that these changes are not final until the board has their meeting in August. We can provide an update after that board meeting. What I would say in more specific answer to your question is that Um, so from a broad perspective, we're going to be as flexible as we can throughout this process. We're going through a transition right now, so we will work with each chapter in LAC to navigate this transition. If you've already made appointments and these changes are approved, I would encourage the chapter boards just to confirm with another vote, so that everyone is appointed by the chapter board. There's a reason for that, which we'll cover in one of the next changes. But the at-large delegate, again, if the Board of Trustees approves this, the at-large delegate concept will go away. Question from Jackie. When assigning delegates, as you know, New Jersey has a LAC that includes a PA delegate. Are there going to be any requirements for that? Is the PA delegate assigned by the PA chapter board? So yes, for Mike and Jackie on this and the Keystone and New Jersey chapter board members present, there are two chapters that cover New Jersey. So the multi-chapter processes in the document we sent out yesterday would govern the appointments process. And again, I would encourage those two chapters to have a conversation on delegate appointments moving forward. Okay, let me move next. Continue to ask questions. I'm going to move on to the next slide. A structure is established for single chapter states and multi-chapter states. So this will be a minimal impact in single chapter states and a moderate impact in multi-chapter states. Again, as I said on the last slide, LACs and chapters must confer on appointments and the delegate number. In multi-chapter states, and this is a key change, you have two options for the allotment of delegates per chapter. You can do it based on the proportion of the chapter's membership in the state. So for example, if there's 1,000 members in the state and there are two chapters and one chapter has 800 members, they would get 80% of the delegates. The other chapter has 200 members, they would get 20% of the delegates, again, based on the number that you all decide is appropriate delegate number for your state. Or you can simply all come together and say chapter A is going to have 6 delegates and chapter B is going to have 4 delegates. Whatever numbers you think are appropriate, maximum flexibility to allow the LAC and the chapter leadership in states with more than one chapter to make those decisions that work best in your state. What doesn't change? Chapter executive directors should be invited, encouraged to attend and monitor LAC meetings. And I would certainly encourage you to consider inviting the chapter presidents to those meetings as well. Let me check to see if there are questions. Okay. So there is one other piece I want to mention here before we go to the next slide. One of the reasons for this change, sorry, let me go back a second. My slides are advancing ahead of me. Okay, we're good. All right, so the next change, delegate terms are staggered. So the entire LAC is not up for reappointment at the same time. So some LACs already observe staggered terms. You won't see any difference with this change. If you do not have staggered terms on your LAC, there will be a significant change here. And so how we suggest you address this is in this year's appointment process for the next 2-year LAC term, half of your delegates should be appointed to a 2-year term, and the other half should be appointed to a 1-year term. Anyone who is appointed to a 1-year term would then be eligible for a 2-year term a year from now for the term that begins October 1st, 2027, and that will establish the normal cycle of staggered terms. And again, what doesn't change, LACs that currently observe staggered terms, you really shouldn't see an impact here. You're already doing this. And the reason for this change is this will help us manage turnover. As many of you know who've been here for at least a few years, the initial 10-year term limit kicked in, I believe, 4 years ago, and we saw a lot of delegates leave LACs at the same time. So this staggered term will help manage that. It's also a best practice for boards and committees to have staggered terms. Our department, the government public affairs staff, will work with you, with your LAC and your chapter to manage this transition and provide information on term limits. Reach out to any member of the GMPA staff. We can let you know if someone is term limited and how these staggered terms can be implemented. So D&O coverage is the next change. This depends on whether the state has one or more than one CAI chapter, and this is based on an opinion from the CAI headquarters D&O carrier. So in single chapter states, D&O coverage of LAC delegates will be with your chapter D&O policy. In multi-chapter states, the LAC delegates will continue to be covered by the CAI headquarters D&O policy. And again, this is based on an opinion we received back in June from our insurance carrier. And the reason for this is that we need to establish effective management control of the Legislative Action Committee in order to determine whose D&O coverage kicks in for the LAC delegates. And so in single chapter states, chapters effectively have that management control based on two key mechanisms, the appointment of delegates and the financial responsibility and tax reporting for the Legislative Action Committee. That gives you management control over the Legislative Action Committee. In multi-chapter states, and we're going to cover this on a later slide, the financial management piece will be transitioning to CAI headquarters, which effectively splits management control over the Legislative Action Committee. And so that's the rationale for the differing D&O coverage based on how many chapters are in your state. Any questions on that one? I would encourage for chapters that are in a single chapter state, certainly encourage you to check with your insurance carriers to see what kind of an impact that may have on your policy as well as your rates.
Yeah, Tony, I can add some commentary in there too. So we looked into this already when kind of heard this was coming down the pike, and there are some major exclusions for any LAC or political attendance at any events. So maybe what we can do is we can share any of the chapters that have already placed this type of coverage. Maybe we can share that in a forum later on.
Certainly, and I'm sorry, I can't see the list of I can't see the who's on screen because of my sharing. Was that either Ryan or Joe from New Jersey?
Ryan, yeah.
Ryan, great. Yeah, if you could reach out to me via email so we can have a conversation about that, that would be great, Ryan.
You got it.
I appreciate that. Let me check the chat. Okay, we're good there. Okay, moving on. So requirement for legislative support committees. This will have a major impact in multi-chapter states. And so the change here is chapters in multi-chapter states will be required to establish a legislative support committee to supplement the work of the LAC delegates in your chapter. In single chapter states, this is optional but encouraged. The chair of the legislative support committee should be one of the LAC delegates. And the purpose here is so legislative support committees will provide opportunities for members who have not been appointed to the LAC to support the work of the LAC, support the public policy goals of the LAC and the organization, assist with fundraising, assist with communication work of the LAC, and legislative support as requested by the LAC. this concept already exists in some states. In California, each chapter has a legislative support committee. And so this will essentially supplement the work of legislative action committees in various states. Again, what doesn't change, the LAC is the body that is authorized to establish legislative priorities, legislative strategy, establish a budget for the LAC, and hire the lobbyist. Any questions on that one? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So delegates from business partner members in a professional category without relevant professional experience will not be considered by the G&PA committee. So the Government Public Affairs Committee has to approve all delegate appointments. The impact here is delegate recruitment should focus on candidates that are necessary to ensure that we have critical professional expertise represented on the LAC, and to prevent candidates who are looking to use the LAC as a networking opportunity. This does not impact the vast majority of delegates who are already serving. If they don't meet this criteria, certainly direct them to other volunteer opportunities, perhaps the Legislative Support Committee, if you're going to establish one, or another volunteer role in the chapter. I want to emphasize here that this is not designed to be exclusionary. We're not looking to kick people off or to prevent people from volunteering, but legislative action committee work requires certain expertise. We need attorneys who are experienced in policy. We need sometimes reserve professionals, insurance professionals to interpret legislation, testify on legislation, etc. We want to make sure that appropriate professional knowledge is represented on the LAC. We're not looking to keep people from serving. We specifically did not define relevant professional experience. This is a case-by-case situation here where we may need to reach out to you in the chapter to say, hey, does this person really meet the needs of the LAC? You may tell us yes, and that's probably going to be fine. The intent here is to make sure that we have appropriate knowledge represented on the Legislative Action Committee. Any questions on that topic? I see two in the chat. Back to the Legislative Support Committee. Would the support committee need to be under D&O as well? I would say no to that question, Mark, because the Legislative Support Committee is a chapter committee. And so that is most likely going to fall under any other chapter volunteer committee, be covered by your chapter's D&O policy. Candace, can you please provide a charter template for the Legislative Support Committee so we don't have to create one? Yes, we can put a document together. We can get some information on how our California chapters handle that as well and share that with you. Thank you, Candace, for raising that. Okay, moving on to the next one. Just making a note here about the charter for the committees. Okay, term limit language has been updated to help preserve institutional knowledge while encouraging the next generation of LAC leaders. Again, this should have a minimal impact on LACs and chapters. Chapters in coordination with the LAC may work within these guidelines in order to preserve institutional knowledge and create a bridge between seasoned and experienced voices on the LAC and the next generation of LAC leaders. We encourage you to consider creating a mentoring committee. Some of you may have mentoring committees for other volunteer roles in your chapters. The headquarters office will work with LACs to help manage these term limits while also ensuring that we have appropriate knowledge and historical knowledge and history present on the LAC. I also want to remind everyone that after someone does reach the 10-year term limit, they need to take 1 year off the LAC before they can be reappointed as a full voting delegate on the LAC. So they're only required to step off for 1 year. What doesn't change, the 5-term 10-year limit is still in place. And again, if you need, as we go through this delegate appointment process over the next 6 weeks to 2 months. If you need to confirm terms and term limits, reach out to CAI headquarters staff, the GMPA staff, and we can get that information for you. Any questions on that one? I don't see any in the chat. Okay, let's move to the next one. A timeline has been added for the LAC reauthorization process. So this loosely exists in the current operational guidelines. We're formalizing the timeline with dates for each step in the delegate appointment process moving forward. So, and the dates are in the document that we sent out yesterday. I don't have them in front of me, but there are established dates for when the GMPA department will notify LACs that the delegate appointment process can begin, a deadline for appointments, a date by which our office will confirm that your appointments have been finalized, a date by which you are to elect officers, etc. So it simply formalizes in the guidelines those key dates for the delegate appointment process. Any questions on that one? Okay. Next, requirements are added to the annual chapter recertification process for chapters and states with a LAC. So this is, it says a minimal impact here, but it is a significant change for chapter executive directors, especially as you're going through the recertification process. So this will establish minimum standards of compliance and collaboration between LACs and chapters, and you'll be required to attest to those annually in the chapter recertification process. This will not be effective until January 2028, when your recertification is due for 2027. So this is a year and almost a year and a half away, but obviously you'll need to be in compliance starting with the next LAC term. So what are some of these requirements? We're asking that the LAC or the chapter provide any lobbyist agreement to the Government and Public Affairs Department, that you invite the staff of the Government and Public Affairs Department to all LAC meetings, confirm that the chapter is following the delegate appointment process. The LAC has a written fundraising plan and chapters are involved in fundraising efforts. The LAC should be providing a legislative update to the board meetings, all chapter board meetings during an active legislative session. That can be an oral update, it can be a written report. And the LAC is providing chapters with items in the communication section of the guidelines. Any questions on that one? Will there be guidelines provided to the chapter boards on the business partner type CAI prefers for delegates? Melina, I wouldn't categorize that as a business partner type that we prefer. You can appoint any business partner type to the LAC. We just want to make sure, obviously, there probably should be an attorney on your LAC. You may want to have a reserve specialist on your LAC, especially if you're in a state where reserve study and reserve funding or building inspection legislation is something that you regularly see. You might want to have an insurance professional, especially if you're expecting legislation that may be making changes to insurance regulations in the state. We've seen a number of those in states this year. So again, it's not designed to be exclusionary, but to make sure that we have certain voices represented. And again, reach out to our office if you want to have a more specific conversation about that. Okay, let's move on to the next change. Operating guidelines formally establish 2-year terms for all officers to align with the 2-year LAC term. So this is a practice, but it wasn't necessarily specified in the existing LAC operational guidelines. So it is now specifically stated, again, assuming the updates are approved, that all officers are elected to a 2-year term. And what doesn't change, most LAC officers are already serving 2-year terms aligned with this. I will also say now with the staggered terms, if you have a delegate who is elected to be an officer and they only have 1 year left in their 10-year term limit, they will only be able to serve 1 year as an officer. They won't be able to serve 2 years because that would effectively extend their 10-year term limit. Any questions on that one? Okay. I want to back up a second and make sure I didn't miss one. Okay, no, we're good there. All right, so the next change, officers are required to participate in a training session at the beginning of their term. This is really a minimal impact. We do host this already every year, but it is critical for the proper operation of the LAC. We are going to require LAC officers to attend this training, be formally informed and educated on what their role is as a LAC officer. We are also going to require officers to sign an acceptance form to certify they've been elected as chair or treasurer or whatever office or position, and that they agree to the duties of the position. And again, the purpose here is education to make sure that the LAC officers understand what their roles and responsibilities are, to abide by CAI's public policies, to abide by positions that the Legislative Action Committee adopts on bills and pieces of legislation, to run the LAC meetings, etc., those types of requirements. Any questions on that change? And that will be held mid to late November, early December each year. Will the training be recorded for any officer unable to attend live during a scheduled training, or will there be multiple opportunities? Yes, we can certainly record that for anyone who misses it. We'll just want to make sure that we can verify they did attend or watch the recording. Are those virtual? Yes, those will be Zoom meetings. Okay, moving on to the next one. Updated organizational chart. Minimal impact here. This just, and this is in the document we sent you yesterday, reflects the new oversight by the Government and Public Affairs Committee. It recognizes LACs and chapters have an equal role in the advocacy work of CAI. It also recommends committees that you all should consider for LACs to support the work of each LAC in your state. A fundraising committee, a policy committee, or a legislative review committee. If you're thinking of or you already host a Capitol Day, a state Capitol Day where you go to the Capitol to advocate as a group, a committee to help organize and run that event, a communications committee to help with the communications work, those types of things. So organizational chart and recommended committees that each LAC should consider forming. Any questions on that update? Okay, let me go to the next one. Structure for a political action committee steering committee. This will really have a minimal impact unless you are considering establishing a PAC. For states that do opt to create a political action committee, we have created a new steering committee structure that will, the CAI headquarters office will take care of the financial reporting and compliance if the PAC adopts this steering committee structure. What doesn't change is if you are in a state that already has a PAC, you can maintain the existing structure that you have. You can continue to do the financial compliance and reporting. But if you want the CAI headquarters office to do that compliance, we will require you to adopt this new political action committee steering committee structure. The point here is that each state has campaign finance laws that PACs must adhere to. Some of them, they all have reporting deadlines. You have to report regularly on contributions and expenditures. Some states have restrictions or limits on contribution amounts, the types of contributions. If your state is considering creating a PAC and you want the CAI headquarters office to handle that compliance end of things, will require you to adopt this PAC steering committee structure. And that will remove the responsibility for reporting, financial reporting, and campaign expense compliance from volunteers or from chapter staff. Any questions on that one? Okay. So the next change, emeritus delegates are now referred to as past delegate advisor. This is a change in terminology. That is the only thing that is changing about emeritus delegates. The term emeritus implies rank and privileges that follow someone who typically has retired from a profession or a position or an institution. And we just didn't feel that that term was appropriate moving forward. And so we're changing that term to past delegate advisor. What doesn't change, and I want to emphasize this, past delegate advisor members, and this is in the existing LAC guidelines, shall not total more than 25% of the standard legislative action committee members. They must also reapply to be a past delegate advisor for each new term, just like regular delegates. They must also sign the conflict of interest and disclosure policy. So this 25% cap, if your LAC has 20 delegates, voting delegates, no more than 5 individuals can be appointed as a past delegate advisor / non-voting member. We also want to emphasize that these past delegate advisors should not function or exercise with the same authority as regular voting members of the LAC. So in the conduct of a LAC meeting, the voting delegates really should be given first opportunity to speak on legislation or a bill position, etc. I know from my experience when I was a chapter executive director and running the Pennsylvania LAC that we relied on these emeritus delegates, these past delegate advisors, most of whom were attorneys who had served a long time on the LAC. We relied on them a lot for their historical knowledge, and that's critical and important. But these past delegate advisors should be, they really should be deferring to the voting delegates on a LAC in terms of meetings, who gets to weigh in first, who gets to speak first. Obviously, the past delegate advisors do not get a vote on any matter before the LAC. They can't vote on bill positions. They can't vote on officers, etc. So just keep that in mind. There is a limit on the number who can serve as a past delegate advisor, and they should not be treated as full voting delegates of the Legislative Action Committee. Any questions on that one? You see 2 in the chat. Are past delegate advisors in addition to the 30 LAC members? Yes, Sarah. So if you decide you're going to have 30 voting delegates on your LAC, you can have 25% of 30 as additional, as past delegate advisors. Claudette, is the term of a past delegate advisor 2 years as well? Yes. And do they need to be staggered? That's a good question, Claudette. I would say yes, appoint them on a staggered term as well. I think that probably makes sense. I'll mull that over more and maybe we'll talk about that internally and see if we need to make a further update to the guidelines to address that. Any other questions on this change? So that they must reapply each year. Yeah, Sarah, what that should say is they must reapply in each appointment period. I think we're going to have to look at that language and refine that. Thank you for pointing that out. We'll take a look at that language and clarify it. Another question from Rachel. How does a LAC establishing a PAC affect states with multiple chapters, particularly when the LAC is covered under Nationals D&O? So PACs are completely separate from the LAC, even though there can be overlapping membership. The PAC makes decisions on which candidates for state legislature the PAC will be making financial contributions to, campaign contributions to. So let me read your question again. How does a LAC, multiple chapters, the D&O coverage? Rachel, we're going to have to get back to you on that in terms of who covers the D&O for PAC steering committee members. I'm gonna say I believe it would be the chapter who is appointing the member to the PAC steering committee, but we will look into that and get back to you. Thank you for raising that. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Responsibility for LAC financial and tax reporting in multi-chapter states will transfer over time to the CAI headquarters finance department. I made reference to this about 10 slides ago when we were talking about establishing management control over the Legislative Action Committee. So this is a transition that's going to take multiple years. For any LAC that is in a state with more than one chapter, the financial responsibility, reporting the income and expenses, and the tax reporting, the chapter in multi-chapter states that is currently taking care of that will be relieved of those responsibilities, and that will be transferred to the CAI headquarters finance department. This is going to take several years for us to complete this process because I believe there's 7 or 8 states with more than one chapter. We've already completed this with the California LAC. That process concluded around July 1st as sort of a pilot program. The intent is to have Florida transfer next later this year. And then we will have a timeline and a schedule for the remaining states with multiple chapters regarding when this will transfer to the headquarters office. And so I want to mention this management control again, because this relates to the finances of the LAC, appointments, D&O coverage. LACs are not official entities in the view of your state. LACs do not have employer identification numbers. LACs do not have incorporation documents with the Department of State. They don't have bylaws in almost all cases. And so there is no formal entity for each legislative action committee. And so that's why some of these changes are being made. What doesn't change, this process will not change in single chapter states. In single chapter states, the chapter will still be responsible for reporting income and expenses for the LAC, the financial statements for the LAC, and including the financial activity on your Form 990 every year. Questions about that one? I see 2 in the chat. In single chapter state, does the LAC file a separate 990 from the chapter 990? No. A chapter in all states as it exists right now, one chapter in every state, whether it's a single chapter state or a multi-chapter state, one chapter is responsible for reporting the LAC financial activity on the chapter 990. The LAC does not have to file a separate 990. Question from Kevin, have the new guidelines been reviewed by a CPA or tax attorney? Let me make this a little bigger so I can see the whole thing. With regard to sufficient financial control for single chapter states to include the LAC on the chapter's tax reporting. Let me reread this so I make sure I understand the question. I don't know that I can adequately answer this question, Kevin, but we have been involved. The headquarters office has had conversations with both multi-chapter states and single chapter states about this financial reporting. The pilot program that I mentioned that just concluded with the California LAC did also involve a single chapter state. So I can follow up with you and get you a better answer to your question. Just bear with me as I make notes here. Okay, next question. Okay, those are just thank yous. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. This is actually the last slide. So that's the extent of the major changes. There's additional cleanup language edits in the document that we sent yesterday. I would encourage you all to review that. The guidelines, the updates were approved last week on July 21st by the CAI Government and Public Affairs Committee and recommended to the Board of Trustees for their consideration. So these changes, none of these changes are final until the board considers them and takes action. They will meet on August 19th. We will provide additional guidance after August 19th based on what the board decides to do. So over the next month or so, we encourage all of you to collaborate with your legislative action committees on the following. Determine what the appropriate number of delegates is for your LAC. Issue a call for volunteers. Some of you have already done this. Determine terms, who's going to be appointed to a 2-year term versus a 1-year term. Excuse me. Chapter boards should vote on nominees. The deadline to submit nominations, which is currently September 15th, can be extended into October if necessary. And I would encourage all of you to reach out to any member of the government and public affairs staff with any questions that you have following this program. We'll help you address any unique situations. We will be as flexible as we can. Again, we're all going to navigate this transition together, and we want to do it in the least disruptive way to both legislative action committees and chapters. So again, review the document we sent out yesterday. Send in any questions that we didn't answer today. I will follow up with the items that were requested during the session today. Let me stop screen sharing so I can see all of you again and see if there are any final questions before we wrap up. Any final questions? Let me see. There's 2 things in the chat. Will there be a new nomination form? So thank you, Mike, for asking that question. Converting all of the forms related to legislative action committees to online forms. So there will be new forms, same information, but it will be an online form versus PDFs. Is there consideration for increasing the LAC contributions that are collected? So this actually did come up when the Government and Public Affairs Committee was debating these changes. That this is a typical question to have come up because we know fundraising is an important function of the Legislative Action Committee. And as Phoebe said in the chat, that's considered each year. It's also evaluated with the cost of membership. And so that's an ongoing conversation, Candace. Claudette, are guidelines around past delegate advisors incorporated? So there is an appendix. We did not share the appendix with all of you. That's still in the process of being cleaned up. The past delegate advisor description is part of the appendix. And when we send out updated guidelines with whatever changes the board may or may not approve, we will include the appendix, and that will have the past delegate advisor language. I do want to reemphasize that the only thing related to past delegate advisors that is changing is the name. We didn't make any other changes to the description of a past delegate advisor. Will there be a new nomination? I already answered that one. Sorry. Okay, that looks like all the questions. Anything else before we wrap up? Phoebe or Kelly or Crystal, anything to add?
Thank you, Tony, and the Government and Public Affairs team for putting this together and any of you on the call today who are a part of this process. Thank you for all of your hard work for making this happen. Again, as I mentioned in the chat, this has been recorded and we will be sending it out to the chapter leadership through our weekly email. So make sure you've got that. If you're not part of those emails, please connect with your chapter executive director or your chapter president or president-elect to get access to that recording as well. And if you do think of any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to the government public affairs team. I'm sure they would be happy to connect with you with any of those questions.